Before we step into the ancient sands of Egypt, before the gods awaken and the first light rises from the deep, I'd like you to take a moment for yourself. Wherever you are right now, allow the day to pause. You've carried so much with you today. Thoughts, tasks, worries, little moments that still echo in your mind. You don't need to hold on to any of them now. Take a slow, deep breath in. Feel your chest rise and let the air fill every corner of your lungs. Now let it out gently, like a soft wind over the Nile at dusk. With each breath, imagine the weight of the day slipping from your shoulders, falling away like grains of sand carried by the river. The tension in your neck, your back, your jaw, let it melt. The thoughts rushing through your head, let them drift away like small boats disappearing into the horizon. In this moment, you are safe, you are still, and you are here. Nothing else is asked of you. Now picture the darkness before time began, endless, quiet, and calm. This is where our journey will start tonight. From this stillness, the first gods will rise, shaping the sky, the earth, and the waters, weaving a world from nothingness. All you need to do is listen and let their story carry you. So rest your body, quiet your mind, and let the ancient voices of Egypt guide you to the dawn of creation. All the major Egyptian creation cycle story, in the time before time, when there was no land to walk upon, no sky to look toward, and no air to breathe, there was only the endless water. It had no beginning and no end, a boundless expanse of darkness and depth, known to those who would speak of it later as none. In that vast stillness there was no motion, save for the slow shifting of possibility, no sound, save for the silence that waited for its first word. Yet within that formless flood lay the seed of all that would ever be, a thought not yet spoken, a spark not yet kindled, an eternity that had not yet begun to count itself. The waters held within them the potential for creation, but the waters themselves were not life. They were the canvas, the vast potentiality, the hidden womb of the world. From the depths of none, the first stirrings began, not as a sudden flash, but as the slow awakening of a dream. In that dream, consciousness rose, a thought that recognized itself, a force that yearned to shape what was formless. This was Atum, who was yet all things and nothing, a being complete in himself, containing the seeds of male and female, motion and stillness, order and chaos. Atum emerged not from any hand or birth, but by his own will, rising upon the first mound that pushed itself above the eternal water. That mound, the Benben, was the place where the first light fell, though no sun yet hung in the sky. It was said in some tellings that Atum came forth as a shining one, clothed in golden radiance, but in others he was the simple form of life's beginning, an undefined presence that only later shaped itself into the forms that mortals would understand. The mound beneath him was warm with the promise of land, and the waters about him glittered faintly with the first hint of reflection. From Atum's being came breath, and with breath came the first wind, and with that wind came separation, the knowing that there was self and there was other. But Atum, standing alone upon the Benben, knew solitude, and in his longing for companionship and continuation, he brought forth the first pair of deities. From himself he generated Shu, the air, to fill the space between all things, and Tefnut, the moisture, to soften and nourish what would one day grow. Some said they came from his spittle, others from his breath, and still others whispered They were born from the secret seed he released into his own hand. However they came, Shu rose as a figure tall and light as the breeze, his arms stretching to keep apart what would otherwise collapse, and Tefnut shimmered like dew, her body flowing, and her voice like the murmur of rivers, yet unborn. Shu and Tefnut set out into the nothingness beyond their father, for there was no land to hold them, no horizon to limit them, and no light to show their path. Time itself was still in its first heartbeat, yet they wandered, weaving currents and vapors into the space around them, shaping the emptiness into a place that could one day receive life. And in the telling of the priests of Hermopolis, even before Atum's first breath, there had been the 8, the Ogdoad, who slumbered in the primordial darkness. 4 pairs, each a god and goddess embodying the primal forces. Nun and Naunet, the endless waters. He and Hauhet, the boundless infinity. Kek and Kalket, the darkness that precedes light. Amun and Amaunet, the hiddenness that veils the yet-to-be. They were not yet the makers, but they were the conditions in which making could occur, swirling like unseen currents beneath the surface of the story. These 8 moved in their own way through the deep, their essences mingling without form, until their churning caused the first mound to rise, the same mound on which Atum would stand, or perhaps another, for in myth the first rising of land is many and one. From that mound the first light glimmered, and some say it was in the city that would one day be Hermopolis that this took place. Others claim it was in Heliopolis, where Atum first called to the world. Still others whisper it happened in Memphis, though the Memphite priests told the tale differently, saying that it was Ptah, the great craftsman, who brought all into being, not through sweat or seed, but through the shaping power of mind and tongue. For Ptah conceived the world in his heart and spoke it into existence, and the words were not mere sounds, but the very pattern of creation itself. Thus, in Memphis, it was said that the gods were born of thought, and that every living thing was a word made flesh. Yet the stories do not quarrel so much as they overlap, like the colours of dawn touching and blending. The rising mound of Heliopolis is kin to the sacred island of Hermopolis, and the thought of Ptah is the hidden spark within Atum's awakening. For all these tellings are ways of grasping what cannot be seen, the moment when nothing became something, when silence learned to speak. Shu and Tefnut, wandering in the vastness, were gone a long time from Atum's sight. The emptiness around him pressed in, and in his solitude he feared he had lost them. So he plucked out his own eye and sent it forth to seek them. This eye was no mere organ, but a living force, fierce and watchful, burning with the will of its maker. It searched the darkness until it found the wandering pair and led them home. When Shu and Tefnut returned to the Benben, Atum wept with joy, and from his tears upon the new earth sprang the first men and women. Thus humanity was born not from command nor accident, but from reunion, from the gladness of a god who no longer stood alone. With Shu and Tefnut by his side, Atum could continue the shaping. Shu lifted high the vault of the sky, separating it from the earth below, while Tefnut moistened the ground so that seeds might one day take root. From their union came Geb, the earth, whose body was broad and rich with promise, and Nut the sky, whose arching form bent protectively over her brother. Geb lay beneath, dark and fertile, while Nut stretched above, her skin alight with the faint shimmer of stars yet unnamed. They clung to each other, sky and earth locked in an endless embrace, until Atum commanded Shu to push them apart, creating the space in which all life would move. Nut arched above as the heavens, Geb remained below as the land, and the air between them became the realm of breath. In this shaping, the world began to take its first true form. Waters gathered into rivers and seas, the black soil of the Nile's banks emerged, and the first winds whispered over the plain. The eye of Atum still watched, fierce and bright, becoming in some tellings the sun itself, in others the cobra goddess who guarded the gods. The heavens slowly turned, the stars beginning their eternal circuits, though the great sun had not yet risen in its full glory. In the Theban tradition, it was Amun, the hidden one, who stirred now, merging with Ra, the solar force, to become Amun-Ra, the king of the gods and the giver of light. This light, once released, poured across the earth, scattering shadows and marking the first true day. From Geb and Nut came the next generation of deities, each destined to shape the fate of the world. Osiris, the green god of growth and order; Isis, the queen of magic and motherhood; Set, the stormbringer and lord of the desert; and Nephthys, the shadowed one, keeper of the hidden places. In Osiris and Isis, the land found its rulers, who would teach humanity the arts of farming, governance, and worship. But in Set, the red force of chaos, the desert wind would ever challenge the green of the fields. These four, along with Horus the Elder, in some tellings, would play out the great drama that unfolded long after the first mound rose from Nun. Yet creation was not a single moment, sealed and done. It was an unfolding, a continual rising of order from the deep. In Memphis, the priest spoke of Ptah shaping not only the first land, but also the Ka, the spiritual essence of every being. The gods themselves were born from his thought, their names spoken into the air, and in their names lay their powers. The fields, the river, the stars, the seasons, all were patterns in his mind before they were form under the sun. And so, even as Atum's children stretched the heavens and laid the earth, they were following the design that Ptah had already shaped in the silence before the first breath. In Hermopolis, the Ogdoad still swirled in memory, their primal forces not gone but hidden beneath the ordered world. For even as light ruled the day and order ruled the land, darkness, infinity, hiddenness, and the endless waters still whispered at the edges of creation. They were not enemies of life, but reminders that all things come from the unknown, and all things will one day return to it. And so the Nile's flooding each year was seen as Nun's breath upon the world, a renewal that both destroyed and nourished, sweeping away the old to make room for the new. As the sky grew bright and the first sunrise spilled over the mound, the world awoke in full. Birds took wing over the waters, their cries piercing the new air. Fish darted in the streams, reeds swayed along the river banks, and the first fields glimmered with green shoots. Humanity, born of Atum's tears, spread across the fertile land, guided by the gods and learning the rhythms of planting and harvest. The temples rose as places where the living might touch the eternal, where the stories of the first time, the Zep-Tepi, would be told and retold so that the act of creation would never be forgotten. In these early days, there was no sharp boundary between the divine and the mortal. The gods walked the earth, their feet upon the same soil as humans, their voices carried by the same wind. The kings of the first dynasties were not mere rulers, but living gods, embodiments of Horus upon the throne, charged with maintaining Ma'at, the balance and truth that held the world together. For creation was not only the making of the world, but its continual keeping, the daily triumph of order over the chaos that forever lapped at the edges, as Nun's waters lapped at the shores of the created land. And thus the world stood, not as a finished thing, but as a living act, a constant rising from the deep. The stories of Atum, Ptah, the Ogdoad, and Amun-Ra were not competing claims, but many voices telling the same truth in different tongues, that the world was born from darkness into light, from silence into sound, from formlessness into form, and that the act of creation was as much an act of will as it was of birth. In the stillness of night, when the desert stars burned cold above the Nile, one could almost hear the deep breath of Nun beneath the earth, reminding all that the waters are always there, waiting. The days of the first age flowed like the Nile in flood, rich and heavy with the silt of beginnings. The gods moved openly across the land, and their presence was not yet distant or veiled. The air still tasted of the breath that had been the first wind, the waters still shimmered with the freshness of their first touch upon the land, and the soil, dark and deep, held the memory of the moment when Geb's body first stretched wide beneath the arch of Nut. Humanity lived close to the divine then, for there was not yet the gulf that time would later dig between gods and mortals. People planted and harvested under the gaze of their creators, and the cycles of the year were the rhythms of the gods themselves. Osiris, firstborn of Geb and Nut, walked among the people as a green-cloaked king, his skin the colour of fertile growth, his crown the white of Upper Egypt and the red of Lower, bound together in unity. He brought to humanity the arts of agriculture, teaching them to coax life from the soil, as he himself drew life from the waters of the Nile. Under his rule, fields thrived, grain grew high, and the stores of the people were full. He taught justice and order, for Osiris was the living embodiment of Ma'at, the harmony that balanced the world between chaos and stillness. Beside him walked Isis, his sister and queen, whose wisdom was deep as the river's current and whose magic wove through every act of life. It was she who taught women the skills of weaving and brewing, who showed healers the herbs that mended wounds, and who whispered to the priests the words that bound the world to its order. But in the heart of creation, even in the time of plenty, there stirred the shadow of Set. Born alongside Osiris, Set was of the desert's blood, his hair the colour of sand, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, but filled with the restless storms that swept across the barren lands. Where Osiris delighted in the green floodplains, Set found his strength in the red waste beyond, where the sun burned harsh and the wind cut like knives. His realm was the place of danger, of sudden storms, of beasts with gnashing teeth. The people feared him, for he was the bringer of drought and sand, but they also respected his power, for without the desert there could be no river, and without challenge there could be no growth. Yet Set's heart was restless, and the praise given to Osiris gnawed at him, like the ceaseless wind scouring stone. The Theban tradition whispered that Amun-Ra, now merged into one supreme force, watched over the land from the sun's high path, each day sailing his great bark across the sky, and each night passing through the underworld to battle the great serpent Apophis, who sought to swallow the light forever. The rising of the sun each morning was not a certainty but a victory, the daily renewal of creation. Mortals could not see the battles fought in the hidden hours, but the gods knew that even in the time of plenty, chaos waited, always pressing against the borders of order. Ma'at had to be maintained not only in the courts of kings, but in the turning of the heavens themselves. In Memphis, the priests of Ptah continued their quiet worship of the god who had spoken all things into being. They believed that every temple, every field, every river channel was part of the design conceived in his heart at the moment of creation. For them, the acts of Osiris, Isis, Set, and all others were not separate from Ptah's will, but expressions of the pattern he had first shaped. Even the strife that would come, they said, was foreseen and necessary, for without it the world could not remain alive. In Hermopolis, the memory of the Ogdoad was still honored, for the people there knew that the primordial waters, the darkness, the infinite expanse and the hiddenness had not disappeared. They lingered just beyond sight, as the deep sea lingers beneath the Nile's surface, and they would rise again when the world's time came to close. Thus the land of Egypt flourished in the Zep Tepi the first time, when gods and mortals walked together. Yet even in the golden light, the seeds of shadow took root. Set's envy grew each year as the harvests under Osiris's rule brought praise and gratitude from every corner of the land. He wandered further into the desert, where the red sands whispered to him of power untapped, of thrones unclaimed. He returned from these journeys with strange companions, beasts that men feared, storms that split the sky with fire, winds that stripped the green from the fields. His presence was a reminder that the balance of creation was not peace without end, but a tension between forces that could never truly be reconciled. In the temples, the priests recited the stories of the creation again and again, for in telling them they renewed the act itself. Each dawn ceremony was not merely the greeting of the sun, but the reenactment of the first rising of light from the mound of none. Each offering to the gods was a small act of creation, an affirmation that the ordered world still stood against the deep. The festivals in honor of Ra's victory over Apophis were not only celebrations, but acts of defense, for it was believed that the serpent's strength was weakened by the voices of those who rejoiced in the sun's return. The people lived in the understanding that creation was fragile and had to be remade each day. It was during such a festival that Set made his first open move against Osiris. While the people sang praises to Ra and poured out wine in honor of the gods, Set prepared a gift for his brother, a chest of cedar and gold, its sides inlaid with lapis and carnelian, its shape and size crafted with exact precision. The story told by mortals said that he brought it forth before the gathered guests, declaring it a gift for whoever might fit it perfectly. One by one the nobles and gods tried, laughing, to lie within it, but none matched its measure until Osiris himself stepped inside. In the moment he did, the lid was slammed shut, sealed with molten lead, and the chest was cast into the Nile, carried away by the current toward the sea. The people mourned, for their king was gone, his green crown vanished beneath the waters. Isis wept, her tears falling into the river until its banks swelled, and she set out to find her husband. She searched the marshes and reed beds, the villages and deserts, guided by the whispers of the wind and the flight of birds. At last she found the chest lodged in the branches of a tamarisk tree in a distant land, the tree having grown around it, enfolding it in its trunk. She brought it back to Egypt in secret, hiding it from Set's eyes. But Set discovered her hiding place, and in a rage he tore the body of Osiris into many pieces, scattering them across the land and the Nile. It is said that in this act Set thought to end his brother forever, but Isis would not be undone. With the help of Nephthys, her shadowed sister, and Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, she gathered each piece, searching the length of the two lands until only one part was missing, lost to the river. With her magic, Isis bound Osiris's body together, wrapping him in linen, breathing life into him long enough for him to give her a son, Horus, before he passed fully into the Duat, the underworld. There, Osiris became lord of the dead, ruling in the land beneath the western horizon, where souls were weighed against the feather of Maat. Though he no longer walked the earth, his presence remained, for the fertility of the land was still his gift, renewed each year when the Nile flooded, as if his green essence flowed in the waters themselves. Horus, the falcon-eyed, grew under his mother's care, his childhood hidden from Set's gaze. As he matured, his wings stretched wide and his cry echoed over the desert. When the time came, he challenged Set for the throne of Egypt, and the gods gathered to judge the contest. Their battle raged across the land, shaking the very foundations of creation. Set became a great red hippopotamus, thrashing the river to foam, while Horus became a falcon, striking with talons and beak. They fought on land and in water, in the courts of the gods and the wild places beyond. The struggle was not only for the kingship of Egypt, but for the very balance between order and chaos. Some tales say the gods could not decide for many years, and that during this time the land suffered both flood and drought, both calm and storm. In the end, Horus was declared rightful ruler, but Set was not destroyed. He was given dominion over the deserts and foreign lands, his storms allowed to sweep the fringes of Egypt as a reminder that chaos could never be fully banished. Thus the balance was maintained, and the kings who ruled after were called the living Horus, protectors of Maat, and heirs to the divine kingship first held by Osiris. Through all these events, the creation of the world remained the foundation upon which everything stood. The priests in Heliopolis spoke of Atum's first rising from none, and in their rituals they invoked his name to renew the cosmos. In Memphis, the words of Ptah were spoken anew, affirming the divine design. In Hermopolis, the Ogdoad were honored in the deep chambers of the temples, their statues depicting frog-headed gods and serpent-headed goddesses, reminders of the primal forces still swirling unseen. In Thebes, Amun-Ra's journey across the sky was celebrated each day, and the hidden battles in the night sky were sung to strengthen his victory over Apophis. The people knew that without these acts, the stories told, the offerings given, the rituals performed, the order of creation would falter, and the waters of none might rise again. Thus the land lived in the knowledge that the first time was not a moment locked in the past, but a living truth. Every sunrise was the first sunrise, every flood the first flood, every birth the first breath of life. The gods had set the pattern, but it was the duty of mortals to keep it moving, to speak the words, to act in harmony with the balance. For in the silence before dawn, the deep waters still waited, patient and eternal, ready to receive all things when their time was done. The rule of Horus marked the continuation of the divine kingship upon the earth, yet it was never a rule untouched by the shadow of Set. For the red land and the black land were forever side by side, the burning desert pressing against the fertile fields, the hot wind challenging the cool breath of the river. The kings who bore the title of the living Horus sat upon thrones of gold and stone, wearing the double crown, but they also carried the weight of the balance. Each act of governance was more than the settling of disputes or the collecting of tribute. It was the daily defense of Maat against the creeping tendrils of Isfet, the unmaking force that lay just beyond the edges of the ordered world. In the great temples of the land, the daily rites continued without pause. At dawn, the high priests entered the sanctuary, washed and pure, their bodies anointed, their words measured to align with the rhythms of the gods. They opened the shrine of the deity, drew back the curtain, and beheld the sacred statue as though it were the god in person. The offerings they laid before it, bread, beer, meat, and incense, were not mere gifts, but the sustenance by which the god renewed their own presence in the world. For without such daily service, it was believed, the gods would withdraw, and creation itself would begin to fray. The cycles of the year moved in patterns that echoed the first time. When the Nile swelled and spilled its banks, the people rejoiced, for they saw in the flood the tears of Isis searching for Osiris, and the green surge of the fields was his return to life. When the waters receded, leaving behind the black silt, the planting began, a reenactment of the first planting in the age of Osiris. The harvest, golden and heavy, was the proof that the world still followed the divine pattern set in those earliest days. Even the festivals of death and mourning were not seen as endings but as renewals, for Osiris's reign in the underworld ensured that the dead too had their place in the order of things. Beneath the surface of this order lay the Duat, the unseen realm stretching beneath the earth and beyond the horizon of the western desert. Here Osiris ruled as judge and king, presiding over the hall of Maat, where each soul stood before him after death. In this hall, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of truth, while Anubis stood watch, and Thoth recorded the judgment. If the heart was light and balanced, the soul passed into the fields of peace, where the harvest was eternal and the Nile flowed forever under gentle skies. If the heart was heavy with falsehood and cruelty, it was devoured by Amit, the great devourer, and the soul ceased to be. But the journey to the hall of Maat was perilous, for the Duat was no still place. It was a realm of winding paths, rivers of fire, gates guarded by serpents, and fields patrolled by watchful spirits. The sun god himself travelled through it each night, passing through 12 hours of shadow in his solar bark, guarded by deities and aided by the prayers of the living. In the deepest hour of the night, Ra confronted Apophis, the serpent of chaos, who sought to halt the sun's passage and swallow the light forever. The victory was never final, for the battle was fought anew each night, but the sun's rising each dawn was the proof that the order still held. In Thebes, the priests of Amun spoke of the hidden nature of the god who was both the sun's visible disk and the unseen force behind all things. To them, creation was not only the shaping of the physical world, but the constant renewal of its hidden essence. They believed that without the daily joining of Amun's hidden power to Ra's visible light, the world would dim and dissolve back into none. The rituals in Karnak's vast halls were designed not only to honor the god, but to strengthen the union that kept light and life bound together. In Memphis, the craftsmen and artisans continued to honor Ptah, seeing in their work a mirror of his act of creation. Every carved statue, every chiseled block, every shaped vessel was an echo of the moment when Ptah shaped the gods themselves with the words of his heart and tongue. For them, the act of making was sacred, a participation in the divine art that had first brought the world into being. Even the building of temples was not only for worship, but as a reaffirmation of the pattern, the laying of stone upon stone in harmony with the cosmic order. In Hermopolis, the memory of the Ogdoad remained alive in the minds of those who tended the temples of Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods. They taught that the 8 primal forces still surrounded creation, unseen but near, and that their presence could be felt in the liminal spaces. The moment before dawn, the pause before a storm breaks, the breath between words. Thoth, as master of knowledge and keeper of divine records, ensured that the story of the first time was never lost, for to forget it was to invite the return of chaos. In their ceremonies, the priests would invoke Nun, Naunet, He, Hauhet, Kek, Kauket, Amun, and Amaunet, not as threats, but as the deep roots from which all life had sprung. Yet, for all the stability that these rituals and beliefs gave to the people, the truth known to the gods was that creation was never safe. It was not a fortress that could be sealed against the night, but a ship that had to be steered endlessly through waters that were always shifting. The forces of Isfet did not come only from the deserts beyond or the storms above, but could rise from within, from greed, from cruelty, from the forgetting of the pattern. When kings neglected the rites, when fields were left untended, when truth was twisted for gain, the balance weakened. In such times the Nile's flood might fail, or the sun's heat might burn too fiercely, or foreign armies might press upon the borders. These were not merely political or natural misfortunes, but signs that the cosmic order was fraying. One such time came when a ruler, proud of his own might, declared that he had no need to follow the old rites, that his word alone was the law. He built monuments to his own name, but he neglected the temples, and the offerings to the gods dwindled. In the Duat, the sun's nightly journey grew more dangerous, for the prayers that aided him were fewer. Apophis swelled in strength, his coils tightening around the solar bark. The Nile's flood came late and low, and the fields cracked in the heat. The people murmured that the king had turned from the pattern, and the land was suffering for it. It was in this darkened season that the priests and the people joined together to restore the rites. They offered to Ra at dawn and to Osiris at dusk. They recited the stories of the first time from memory and carved them anew on temple walls. Craftsmen worked day and night to rebuild neglected shrines, their chisels striking like the heartbeats of the world. In the temples of Thebes, the great festival of Opet was revived, carrying the image of Amun from Karnak to Luxor in a procession of music, incense, and dance. The air filled with hymns, and the river shimmered with the reflection of torches at night. Slowly, the land responded. The Nile rose higher the next year, the fields grew green again, and the people felt the warmth of the sun as a blessing rather than a burden. The king, humbled, returned to the old ways, placing his name alongside the gods rather than above them. From that time, it was remembered that no ruler, however mighty, could hold the land without holding to Myat, for the king's crown was but a reflection of the crown worn by Horus in the first time. And so the cycles turned. Each year was a miniature of creation, each reign a retelling of the divine kingship. The people lived in the awareness that they were not merely inhabitants of the land, but participants in the keeping of the world. To plant was to aid Osiris, to speak truth was to strengthen Maat, to tell the stories was to renew the first time. Even the simplest act, if done in harmony with the pattern, was an act of creation. Beneath it all, none waited, not as an enemy, but as the beginning and the end. The waters were patient, knowing that one day the gods would withdraw, the temples would fall silent, and the land would sink back beneath the deep. But until that day, the pattern would hold, as long as there were those who remembered. In the cool nights when the stars turned slowly over the dark desert, one could feel the presence of the first mound still rising in the heart of the world, the breath of atoms still moving in the wind, the words of Ptah still echoing in the craftsman's hammer, the eight still murmuring in the spaces between moments. Creation was not a tale told once, but an endless story, unfolding as long as there were voices to speak it and hands to shape it. The seasons turned as they always had, yet in the turning there was never complete rest. For even in the years of peace and plenty, when the Nile flooded richly and the granaries swelled with grain, the gods knew that the balance was never guaranteed. Mahat was a living thing, as fragile as the stem of a papyrus reed in the wind, and it had to be guarded at every moment against the gnawing edge of Isfet. To mortals, the sun's rise each morning might seem certain, a rhythm that needed no tending, but to the gods it was a victory, earned anew through the long peril of night. Each evening, as the sun sank toward the western horizon, Ra left the visible sky and descended into the Duat, the realm beneath the earth. The golden disk that mortals saw setting was only the outward sign of this journey, for the true path was through darkness, along the winding river that flowed through the 12 regions of the night. In his solar bark, Ra was not alone. Beside him stood other gods, guardians and warriors, steering and defending the vessel. Maat herself was there, her feather held high as a constant reminder of the balance they fought to preserve. In the first hours, the Duat was lit by the fading glow of the day, its banks lined with fields where the blessed dead toiled eternally in joy, reaping crops that never failed. But as the journey went on, the light dimmed, and the air grew thick with the presence of things that were not meant for the living to see. Serpents the length of ships coiled along the banks, their eyes glowing with hunger. Crocodiles with many heads slipped into the dark waters, their jaws clicking softly. Spirits whose faces were hidden behind masks watched from the reeds, whispering in voices that carried both promise and threat. It was in the deep hours, when even the stars above the earth had faded from mortal sight, that the greatest danger came. Here waited Apophis, the serpent of chaos, vast as the horizon, his coils endless, his mouth opening wide enough to swallow the sun itself. Born from the same darkness that had once been Nun, Apophis had no love for the ordered world. He sought only to unmake it, to drag it back into the formless deep. His eyes burned with a light that was not warmth but hatred, and his breath was a foul wind that stilled the river's current. As Ra's bark approached, Apophis would rise from the water in a great arch, his shadow blotting out the faint glow that remained. The battle that followed was never exactly the same, for Apophis was cunning and ever-changing in his attacks. Sometimes he sought to entangle the bark in his coils, squeezing until the timbers groaned and the gods strained at their oars. Sometimes he opened his jaws to swallow the vessel whole, his gullet a tunnel into the void. But always the defenders of Ra met him with spears, with nets woven of magic words, with knives of meteoric iron that could cut even the body of a god. Set himself, for all his strife with the other gods, was often called upon in these moments, for his strength and ferocity were unmatched in the battle against the serpent. With his great spear he would stand at the prow, striking again and again, driving Apophis back into the depths. When Apophis was defeated, he did not die, and the chaos could not be destroyed, only beaten back for a time. His body would sink into the dark waters, and the bark would sail on, carrying Ra toward the eastern horizon. There, in the 12th hour of the night, the renewed sun would be born again from the body of Nut, rising into the sky to begin another day. The people on earth, waking to the dawn, might not know the details of the battle, but they felt its result in the warmth upon their faces, in the light on the river, in the very fact that the world was still here. The priests of Egypt taught that this nightly struggle was not only a tale of the gods, but a truth about the nature of all things. Every victory over chaos was temporary, and every day's peace was a gift bought with vigilance. In the fields, farmers saw it when weeds returned to choke the crops, when locusts came in swarms, when the desert winds carried sand into the furrows. In the courts, scribes saw it when lies threatened to replace truth, when greed bent justice from its straight path. To live in Ma'at was not to live without challenge, but to face challenge again and again, as Ra faced Apophis each night. In Thebes, great festivals were held to aid Ra in his journey. The priests and people would gather before dawn, their voices lifted in hymns, their hands raising offerings of bread and beer. Torches flared, casting red light upon the temple walls as chants were spoken to bind Apophis and weaken him. The belief was that every human voice added strength to the gods in their battle, that the cries of the faithful could be heard even in the deepest darkness of the Duat. In this way, the people became part of the act of creation's renewal, their songs another weapon in the fight against unmaking. Meanwhile, in Memphis, the followers of Ptah taught a subtler version of the same truth. They spoke of Apophis not only as a serpent in the Duat, but as the embodiment of unformed thought, of words not yet spoken, of ideas left in the shadows where they could twist into poison. For them, the battle against chaos was fought not only with spears, but with clarity of mind and precision of speech. Just as Ptah had shaped the world through the words of his heart, so too could a careless or false word begin to unshape it. Their rituals focused on speaking the right names in the right order, affirming the patterns that kept the world steady. In Hermopolis, the memory of the Ogdoad gave the battle another meaning. They saw Apophis as a remnant of the primal chaos that had once been the whole of existence, and they acknowledged that without some measure of that chaos, creation could not have come to be. The struggle, then, was not to destroy chaos, but to keep it in its proper place, to allow it to be the fertile darkness from which life could rise, without letting it flood and drown the light. Their ceremonies honored both the ordered gods and the deep forces beneath, seeking harmony between them rather than endless war. Yet the gods themselves knew that the time would come when Apophis would win. For nothing created could last forever, and the waters of none were patient. When that final night came, the bark would fail to rise from the depths, the sun would not return, and the world would slip silently beneath the surface of the primeval sea. But this was not a cause for despair to the Egyptians, for they understood that ending and beginning were bound together. Just as the sun died each night and was born again at dawn, so too would the world one day end, only to rise again in another first time. In the meantime, life went on, bound to the rhythm of the river, the turning of the seasons, and the daily battles of gods and men alike. Kings ruled and passed into the underworld, their statues standing in the temples to remind the living of their place in the pattern. Children were born, learned the stories, and took their place in the unending work of keeping Ma'at. Temples rose in stone and fell into ruin, only to be built again upon the same sacred ground. The myths themselves shifted in the telling, but the core truth remained. Creation was a living thing, and it lived only as long as it was fed with care, remembrance, and right action. Sometimes, during the great feasts, plays would be performed in the temple courts, reenacting the battles of Ra and Apophis, or the murder and restoration of Osiris. These were not merely entertainments, but living rituals, in which the actors were not pretending to be the gods, but serving as their vessels. When Set raised his spear against the serpent in the play, it was believed that he lent his strength to the true Set in the duat that very night. When Isis bound the limbs of Osiris on the stage, she was binding him in truth, ensuring that the fertility of the land would not fail. Thus, myth and life were woven together without seam, each reflecting and sustaining the other. A farmer in his field, casting seed into the furrow, was enacting the same truth as the priests in the temple, that the world began in darkness and emptiness, and it was the work of gods and men to bring it into light and fullness again and again. Every grain that sprouted, every child that laughed, every honest word spoken in judgment was another small victory over the serpent. And so, through the uncounted years, the cycles turned. The battles in the night sky were fought, the floods came and receded, the harvests rose and were stored. The people did not see themselves as separate from the gods, but as partners in the keeping of the world. The first time was not long ago and far away, but here and now renewed with every dawn. And as long as the dawn came, the story would go on. In the unfolding ages after the first great schism between earth and sky, the world was far from a tranquil place. Though Ra's sunbark cut its perfect arc each day, though Shu held Nut aloft and Geb stretched beneath her, the balance trembled under the weight of choices yet to be made by gods and mortals alike. Osiris, the Green Lord, walked the fertile black land that drank deeply of the Nile's gift, teaching men and women to coax grain from mud, to weave reed into shelter, to shape boats that would carry them like swift fish through the glittering current. His presence was like the scent of freshly opened lotus, bringing peace wherever it drifted. By his side was Isis, whose wisdom moved quietly as the river at night, unseen yet guiding all life upon it. Together they shaped a reign that was more than rule. It was harmony between divine order and the pulse of the living world. But far in the reaches of shadow, where Ra's light could not fully banish the darkness, a hunger was growing in the heart of Seth. He was the brother of Osiris, yet in his nature lay the restless storm. The desert wind sang in his ears, and its voice was one of jealousy. He saw the fields bending in praise of Osiris, the people offering their prayers first to the Green Lord and the Mother of Magic, and he felt the emptiness of his own barren dominion. In the tales of the people, Seth was protector of Ra's nightly voyage through the underworld, a warrior who struck at the serpent Apophis to guard the sun's rebirth. Yet this duty, great though it was, did not still the ache for recognition in his soul. The seeds of his unrest began to take root, watered by pride and shadow. In the heart of Heliopolis, the priests tended the great obelisks, monuments that drank the sun's fire and gave it back to the city. They spoke of Ma'at, the delicate balance between order and chaos, the breath of the world itself. But they too whispered of omens. The flooding of the Nile had come earlier than expected, bringing bounty but also strange patterns in the currents. The ibis, sacred to Thoth, had flown in unusual formations, as if drawing invisible signs in the air. Some said it was merely the play of nature, others that the gods were sending warnings through feather and tide. Isis, attuned to such currents, felt the underlayer of danger that lay coiled beneath the season's prosperity. Meanwhile, in the temples of Memphis, the priests of Ptah continued their own telling of creation, how the world was shaped not by struggle, but by the thought and word of the great architect. They taught that the heart conceived and the tongue spoke, and thus the world came into being. These teachings reached the ears of common folk and mingled with the tales of atoms, self-creation, and the cosmic egg of Hermopolis, weaving a living tapestry of belief. Yet beneath the sacred chants and carved reliefs, the human heart still beat to the rhythms of ambition and envy, the same currents that stirred in the gods themselves. It was during a festival in honor of Ra, when the sun stood at its highest and the scent of incense mingled with the heat of the air, that Seth began to weave his plot. He moved among the revelers unseen, cloaked not in magic but in the careful concealment of his intent. He knew Osiris loved the celebrations of the people, walking among them as an equal, taking their offerings not as tribute, but as gifts freely given. In this love lay the seed of Seth's plan, for he would use generosity as the snare. The feast was grand. Barley bread baked in the shapes of lotus flowers lay beside roasted fowl and sweet dates heavy with honey. Musicians played the sistrum and flute, their music rising like the chatter of the papyrus reeds in wind. In the center of the gathering stood a great chest, crafted of rare cedar from distant Byblos, its surface inlaid with gold and lapis lazuli. It was a marvel, and Seth, with the voice of a host, playing at kindness, declared it a gift for the one who fit within it most perfectly. His words were light, almost playful, and so the people laughed and stepped forward to try. One by one they climbed inside, but none matched the chest's exact measure. When at last Osiris was urged to try, the chest seemed to embrace him, its inner shape moulded as though carved by divine foresight. Before laughter could become wonder, Seth slammed down the lid and sealed it with molten lead. His followers, giants of desert strength, rushing to carry it to the river. The Nile, that giver of life, now became the silent accomplice, bearing the coffin downstream into the unknown. Isis's cry rose above the festival's music, her voice a blade of grief. She searched the river's banks for days and nights without rest, her feet cutting upon sharp stone, her hair tangled with wind and dust. The people whispered of the queen wandering as a lone star, seeking her lost light. Her journey carried her beyond the borders of Egypt, into the marshes and coasts where foreign tongues were spoken. It was in Byblos that she found the chest lodged in the roots of a great tamarisk tree, its trunk grown thick around the divine coffin, as if to hide it from the world's sight. The king of that land, not knowing the sacredness of the wood, had cut down the tree to make a pillar for his hall. Isis, veiling her identity, entered his court as a nurse to the royal children. By night, she tended the youngest with strange, healing warmth. By day, she watched the pillar in silence. When the time came and her true form was revealed, the king trembled before her and gave the chest into her care. She carried it back to Egypt, hoping to restore Osiris to life, for her magic was great and her will greater still. But Seth's eyes were never far. Finding where Isis had hidden the chest, he tore it open in rage and cut the body of Osiris into many pieces, scattering them across the length of the land and into the waters of the Nile. In this act, Seth thought to end not only his brother's life, but also the order he embodied. Yet Isis was not alone in her grief. Her sister Nephthys, though bound to Seth, pitied Osiris and aided Isis in the search. Together they gathered the fragments. Each piece reclaimed a victory over despair. Only one part was lost to the river, swallowed by a fish, but even this absence could not halt the power of Isis's rites. Calling upon the breath of Thoth, the life-giving wind of Shu, and the hidden magic that lay in the first word Ptah ever spoke, Isis reassembled Osiris. In the quiet of the marshes, she took the form of a kite, her wings casting shade over his still body, and conceived a child from the spark of his spirit. This child would be Horus, the avenger, the bridge between the living and the dead, between the wrong done and the justice yet to come. Osiris, though restored in form, could not walk again among the living. Instead, he descended into the Duat, the underworld, where he became lord and judge of the dead. There he sat upon the throne in the hall of Maat, weighing the hearts of souls against the feather of truth. His rule brought structure to the unseen realm, as his reign once had upon the earth. And so the order of the world shifted. Ra ruled the sky by day, Osiris ruled the underworld by night, and upon the earth the fate of kings and farmers alike began to turn toward the coming struggle between Seth and Horus. In the years that followed, the stories of creation and of this divine tragedy intertwined in the minds of the people. They saw in Atum's lonely self-birth the seeds of both creation and isolation, in the cosmic egg the fragile unity that could be cracked by envy, in Ptah's shaping word, the possibility that all things might be spoken into harmony again. And as the sun rose and set, The Nile flooded and withdrew. They waited for the day when Horus would rise, falcon-eyed and steady, to claim the world his father had loved. In the stillness that followed the death of Osiris, Egypt seemed to hold its breath. The Nile flowed as it always had, yet its waters carried a subtle heaviness, as if the river itself mourned. The fertile lands drank from it, but the grain rose slower, the stalks pale, for the earth without Osiris felt less certain, its cycles wounded. Isis walked the length of the riverbanks in silence, her garments darkened with dust, her hands trailing along the reeds as if they might whisper to her the path to undo this wrong. Nephthys stayed near her, loyal in her grief, despite the blood she shared with Set, her voice soft, but her gaze fierce, a silent vow forming in the spaces between her words. In hidden places of the two lands, the people whispered of what had happened. They dared not speak Set's name too loudly for fear his spies would hear, but they told each other that a day would come when justice returned, when the rightful order of the gods would rise again. In temples the priests lit lamps before the statues of Osiris, praying in low tones to keep his Ka strong, even in the darkness of the Duat. In the realm beneath the earth, Osiris found himself in a place unlike any he had known. The Duat was not simply a land of death, it was a reflection of the living world, a mirror of Egypt where the river was made of stars and the sky was an endless cavern of stone. The air shimmered with the whispers of countless souls, some lost and wandering, others guided toward judgment. Osiris walked through its winding paths, the walls carved with the stories of the gods, lit by the eternal glow of the sun-bark as Ra's nightly journey carried him through. He realized then that though his body had been struck down, his being still had purpose. For without a guide, the dead would falter, their hearts unmeasured, their destinies scattered. It was here that the great cycle revealed itself to him. Life flowed into death, death into life, and each sustained the other. In time, Osiris became the lord of this hidden realm, seated upon a throne of green stone, crowned with the Atef crown, holding the crook and flail across his chest. At his feet lay the scales of truth, guarded by Anubis, who weighed the hearts of men against the feather of Maat. It was a throne born not of ambition but of necessity, for in his keeping was the balance of the afterlife itself. Yet above, in the realm of the living, Set's rule began to twist the harmony that had once defined Egypt. His strength was not tempered by compassion, and the seasons turned unevenly under his hand. Storms struck the fields too soon or too late. The desert winds rose more fiercely, and the people began to murmur their discontent. Still, none dared to rise against him openly, for Set's wrath was quick, and his cunning sharper than any blade. In secret, Isis worked. She knew that Osiris's body had been hidden by Set, scattered in pieces across the two lands, so that no magic could restore him. But Isis was not one to surrender to the finality of death. She called upon the winds, the birds, the beasts of the marshes, asking them to lend her their eyes. Slowly, she found the places where the fragments of Osiris had been concealed, buried in the earth, cast into the river, hidden within stone. Nephthys helped her gather them, wrapping each in linen and speaking over them the words that called to the Ka of her brother. Piece by piece they rebuilt him, until at last Osiris's body lay whole, though lifeless, upon a bier in the shadow of a sacred tamarisk tree. Then Isis knelt beside him, her voice a low hum that grew into the ancient song of renewal. Her breath passed over his lips, her hands traced the lines of his chest, her tears fell onto his brow like drops of the Nile at its rising. Through her magic and her love, Osiris stirred. His eyes opened, not to the realm of the living, for his place was now in the duat, but long enough for him to hold her gaze and know that their bond had defied even the grasp of death. In that brief union, Horus was conceived, though no mortal hand would see his birth for many moons. When Set learned of this, his fury was like a desert storm. He sought to destroy the child before it could draw its first breath, for some whisper of prophecy had reached him that the son of Osiris would be his undoing. Isis fled to the marshes of Chemis, hiding among the reeds where the papyrus grew thick, and the air shimmered with the hum of dragonflies. There, in a hut woven from river plants, she gave birth to Horus, guarded by the goddess Selkit, and watched over by the silent stars. The boy's cries were like the call of a falcon, sharp and clear, and his eyes burned with the light of the sun. He grew quickly, for the blood of gods flowed in him, and his heart was shaped by the tales his mother told, of Osiris, of the balance of Maat, of the wrongs done by Set. In the duat, Osiris watched through the thin veil between worlds, his pride deep, but his touch forever barred from the realm above. Horus learned the arts of war from the gods who favored him, and the wisdom of judgment from his mother. He hunted in the marshes, his feet sure on the shifting ground, his eyes ever scanning the horizon for signs of his uncle's spies. When the time came, he would be ready, but Set was not idle. He sent serpents to crawl into the boy's cradle, scorpions to hide beneath his bedding, and storms to batter the marshes. Each time Isis's magic shielded her son, and the plots came to nothing. The years passed, and Horus's wings, both in spirit and in the falcon's form he could take, grew strong. One day Horus left the safety of the marsh and went to the great court of the gods to claim his right to rule the two lands. There, before Ra, before Thoth, before Mahat herself, he spoke of Set's crimes and of the blood that bound him to Osiris's throne. The gods debated long, for Set was not without his defenders. Some argued that his strength had kept chaos at bay, that his power was needed against the forces that threatened the borders of creation. Others saw in Horus the promise of a just ruler, one who would restore balance to the land. Ra himself was torn, for Set had once stood at his side to battle Apep in the nightly journey through the duat, and such service weighed heavily in the judgment. Thus began the long trial between Horus and Set, a contest of strength, wit, and endurance. They raced in boats carved of stone, fought in the desert winds, and tested each other in riddles and cunning traps. Each time Horus triumphed, Set found a way to twist the outcome or demand another trial. The gods watched, their patience thinning, as the contest stretched on for years. At last, Horus challenged Set to a final battle, a duel that would leave no doubt. They met upon the plain where the red sands met the green fields, the wind howling and the sun burning overhead. Horus came with the speed of the falcon, his spear in hand, his eyes unblinking. Set came with the fury of the storm, his mace raised high, his laughter like thunder. The clash shook the earth, the Nile's waters trembling in their course. Blood fell upon the sand, and the cries of the combatants echoed into the farthest reaches of the Duat. It was then that Isis appeared, stepping between them, her presence stilling the air. She looked upon Set, and for a moment pity stirred in her. He was her brother still, a god of Egypt, though his hands were stained. But Horus's wrath had no room for such mercy. In that hesitation Set struck, wounding Horus and fleeing into the desert winds. The gods were divided still, and the judgment was delayed once more, the balance hanging by a thread. Now the world was no longer raw and formless. The great shaping had taken hold. The heavens arched above like the belly of nut, jewelled with the seeds of night. The earth lay steady beneath, the flesh of Geb warmed by Ra's journeying light, and between them Shu's breath still held space for all the living things to move. The rivers carried the black silt each year, as though the very blood of Osiris were feeding the fields, and the grain grew golden in the light of the sun. The people had learned the sacred rhythms from Thoth, who wrote them into being with the precision of a master craftsman, marking the days, dividing the seasons, telling when to plant and when to reap. But in the high places of the sky, the gods were restless, for the balance that Mayat demanded was always under threat from the whisper of Isfet, the shadow of disorder. And though Set had been bound in chains of divine justice, his spirit was not stilled. In the silence between the hours, he gnawed upon his anger and planned. Ra, who had grown older in his daily voyages, began to feel the wear of time, though the sun still blazed in his bark. He saw the generations of mortals passing swiftly, and he understood that the world was now as much theirs as it was the realm of the gods. But not all men remembered gratitude. Some raised their hands against the order, and in the hearts of a few the seed of rebellion grew. Ra withdrew into his hidden shrine to think, and in that stillness he recalled the time when the great flood of Nun had covered all things. A thought took root in him, as thoughts do when they circle back to the beginning, and he wondered if perhaps the world had grown too far from its first perfection. Yet while Ra pondered, Ptah in his temple at Memphis continued his silent shaping, speaking in the deep voice of the heart. He felt the tremor in the fabric of creation when doubt stirred in the sun god's mind. And in distant Hermopolis the Ogdoad, the 8 primordials, stirred faintly in the waters of Nun, for they too sensed a shift. The dark frog-heads and serpent-heads of ancient night moved as though tasting the air, remembering the time before light. Across the two lands, priests and wise men dreamed of strange omens, a crocodile swimming backward in the river, a hawk flying without shadow, a lotus blooming at night. All these things were read as signs that change was coming, though none could say if it was the change of growth or the change of ruin. In the palace of Osiris and Isis in the Duat, the hall of judgment remained steady, for the dead still came, their hearts weighed against Maat's feather. Anubis guided them, and Thoth recorded their fates. But even there a subtle unease spread. Some newly arrived souls spoke of dreams they had in life, where the sky cracked and a river of darkness poured down. Osiris listened with a calm face, but his green hands clenched the arms of his throne. He remembered too well the day Set had torn him apart, the day the body of the earth was broken. Isis, wise in all magic, began to weave quiet protections, inscribing spells not only for the living, but for the very bones of the earth. Above all this, Nut arched her starry body and wept quietly for her children, for she knew that no order lasts forever. Even Ma'at must be renewed with effort each day, and if that effort fails, the unshaped waters are always waiting, patient as eternity. The first stirrings of unrest reached the borders of the world. From the desert edges came strange spirits, born of places where the Nile did not flow, and the fertile land gave way to sand that burned by day and froze by night. These spirits carried no allegiance to Ma'at. They were wild children of Isfet, whispering into mortal ears the temptations of greed, violence, and pride. At first, they were but a few voices, but like the first grains of sand in a rising storm, they gathered more to them. Ra saw it from his high seat in the daybark. He called upon Sekhmet, the lioness, fierce daughter of his eye, to descend and burn away the rebels. She went gladly, her mane a halo of fire, and where she walked, the earth drank the blood of the fallen. Yet her fury was great, and soon it mattered little to her whether those she struck down were guilty or merely near the guilty. The red of battle stained the fields until even Ra recoiled. He ordered her to stop, but Sekhmet was lost in the taste of blood. Only when cunning Thoth tricked her with jars of beer, dyed red to resemble the blood she loved, did she drink and fall into a deep, roaring sleep. The slaughter ended, but Ra's heart was heavy. He withdrew still further from the affairs of men, leaving the rule of the two lands more and more to Horus, son of Isis, whose falcon eyes watched keenly for Set's return. Horus governed with a just hand, but the shadow of his uncle's malice was never far. In the far reaches of the Red Land, Set's laughter sometimes carried on the wind, mocking, promising. The gods knew they could never destroy him utterly, for he was part of the balance. Without the Red Land, there could be no Black Land. Without the harsh desert, the river's bounty would be meaningless. Still, they could contain him, and so the old battles flared now and then like brief storms. In these times, mortals looked to the temples more than ever, offering prayers, food, and song to keep the gods' favor. The festivals of the year became even more important, for each one was a renewal of the first creation, a re-anchoring of Ma'at against the pull of chaos. Meanwhile, in Memphis, Ptah spoke again the words of crafting, strengthening the foundations of the world. He called upon Seer, the divine perception, and Hu, the divine utterance, to anchor thought and speech in harmony. And deep in Hermopolis, the Ogdoad began to dream a dream of light so bright that even Ra turned his gaze. They dreamed of the lotus that rose from none at the dawn of time, of the first cry of the child sun. In their dream, they cradled that child again, and from the blue petals the first light spilled into the waking world once more, as if the creation itself were breathing in and out across the ages. Mortals, sensing something vast and unseen moving in the heavens, began to tell their own stories of the beginning, mixing truth and symbol until the lines blurred. They spoke of a time when the gods themselves might grow weary and sleep, and it would be up to the people to keep the lamps of the temples burning so that the sun would rise. These tales spread, and though they were simple, they carried a quiet power, for belief shapes the unseen. The gods heard these murmurs, and some smiled while others frowned, but all understood that the hearts of mortals were now a thread woven into the fabric of creation itself. The Nile rose and fell as it always had, but in certain nights when the moon was hidden, the river seemed to carry voices that were not of this earth. Fishermen told of seeing great shapes moving just beneath the surface, shapes like coiling serpents or giant frogs, ancient and patient, watching. The priests of Hermopolis said these were signs that the Ogdoad were nearer than they had been since the first dawn. The priests of Heliopolis countered that it was Ra's renewal approaching. The priests of Memphis claimed it was Ptah preparing to speak the next great shaping. And the people, hearing all these voices, simply offered to all the gods at once, to be certain none were offended. And so the world in that age was poised between renewal and undoing, the balance like a delicate reed boat riding the currents. The gods watched, the mortals prayed, and somewhere in the dark beyond the stars, the first waters waited, listening. The desert stretched out in pale silence, the breath of the sun heavy upon the land, and the great river winding through its spine like a thread of life that no god dared sever. Time had passed since the settling of Horus upon the throne of the living, and the earth, though governed, carried within it both harmony and fracture. The gods had turned their eyes to matters beyond mortal reach, for even divine victories never truly erased the shadow of discord. In the hidden spaces of the Duat, the nightly voyage of Ra continued, each evening casting the sun into the horizon, each dawn birthing it anew. The cycle was eternal, yet in its eternity lay endless struggle. For in the deepest coils of darkness, Apophis the great serpent stirred, his body as long as the horizon, his eyes unblinking in their hatred of light. No mortal could see his strikes, yet all felt them in moments when storms veiled the sky or the river's flood came late. Every night, as Ra's solar bark sailed through the underworld, the serpent rose from the waters of primeval chaos, seeking to swallow the bark whole and extinguish the flame of existence. Mahat stood at the prow, the feather of truth upon her brow, and her silent presence was enough to keep the crew steady. At her side stood Set, whose role, once bound to the desert winds and the storms of chaos, had been reshaped by necessity. Though his past was filled with betrayal and the blood of Osiris, here he was the spear against the serpent, the roar against the swallowing silence. His blows against Apophis were the only thing that kept the serpent at bay, for in this battle there was no room for enmity among gods. Behind them, the god of knowledge, Thoth, murmured incantations older than the world itself, each syllable a weapon forged in the breath of creation. With his words, the sky remained unbroken, and the waters of Nun stayed sealed outside the borders of reality. But this nightly war was not the only battle being fought. On the earth above, mortals struggled with the balance between reverence and forgetfulness. Temples stood in the sunlight, filled with offerings, yet in the villages far from the river's edge, whispers rose that the gods no longer walked among them as they once did. Priests sought to bridge the gap, invoking the old stories of the mound that rose from chaos, of Atom's breath and Shu's lift of the heavens, of Nut's starry body stretched over the earth. In their retelling they wove the Hermopolitan 8, those shadowy beings from before the first dawn, and the Memphite vision where Ptah shaped all things through thought and word. By keeping all versions alive, they hoped to bind the faith of the people to the eternal order, for even conflicting truths could strengthen the whole if remembered together. Yet the duat whispered otherwise. Beneath its hidden rivers and shadowed halls, Osiris ruled as the just and silent king of the dead. His throne was set beside a lake of still water, and from it he judged the spirits of mortals. Each heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and those whose hearts were heavy with falsehood or cruelty were given to Amit, the devourer, whose crocodile jaws ended their journey forever. But for the pure, a new life awaited in the field of reeds, a place where crops grew without end and the river flowed in endless peace. Osiris looked upon his realm with steady eyes, yet he felt the ripple of unease, for the more Apophis strained against Ra's passage, the more restless the dead became, as though the serpent's chaos seeped into even this most sacred of lands. It was Isis who sensed the danger first, her mind ever attuned to the currents of fate. She walked between the living and the dead, calling upon magic woven in the time before the first sunrise. She knew that Apophis was not merely a beast of chaos, but a memory of the void that had never been tamed. His very presence was a reminder that creation had not destroyed none. It had only shaped a fragile bubble of order within it. Should that bubble break, the waters of the primeval ocean would rush in, swallowing all. In the city of Thebes, the priests of Amun spoke in hushed tones. Amun, the hidden one, whose power lay beyond sight, had withdrawn into the secret chambers of the sky. They believed he was weaving new currents within the unseen, preparing for a great act. And so, in the temple at Karnak, they enacted rites that called upon not only Amun, but also Ra and Ptah, blending the powers of the hidden, the visible, and the shaping mind. The rituals were long and filled with smoke and song, their cadence like the heartbeat of the earth. On the banks of the river, a boy born under the rising flood dreamt of the first day. In his sleep, he saw the lotus bloom in the darkness and Ra's newborn light spilling into the air. He saw the 8 of Hermopolis swimming in the black waters, their shapes half frog, half serpent, whispering the names of the stars before they had even burned. He saw Ptah carving mountains out of thought, pulling rivers from the silence with nothing but a spoken word. The boy awoke with tears in his eyes, for in his dream he also saw the serpent's coils tightening around the sun. He told no one, but every morning he laid a reed boat upon the water and whispered a prayer to the gods who fought unseen. The season of inundation came, yet the waters were strange that year, late in their rise and heavier in their colour, as though the river carried shadows within its depths. Fishermen whispered that they saw shapes moving under the surface that were not fish, and once a boatman claimed to glimpse an eye as large as his palm watching him from the current. The priests took this as a sign that the serpent's hunger was spilling into the mortal world. Offerings increased, incense burned without rest, and statues of Ra were carried through the streets so that his light might cleanse the land. In the night, the solar bark plunged deeper than before, as if the duat itself had stretched. The stars above grew thin, and the black waters at the edge of reality surged higher. Apophis struck, his jaws snapping around the hull, his body pressing against the sides of the universe. Set roared and drove his spear into the serpent's eye, a burst of golden light spilling out, but still the coils tightened. Maat's feather trembled in the wind, and Thoth's spells burned with desperate force. The gods knew that the serpent was drawing strength from somewhere beyond their realm, and this frightened even them. In the court of Osiris, the dead gathered in greater numbers, as though the gates of the living world were opening more quickly. Osiris stood, his voice deep as the Nile's flow, and sent a message to Isis. She listened, and for the first time since Horus's victory, she left her seat in the temples of the living and travelled into the hidden places between worlds. There she sought the Hermopolitan Eight, the old gods of the pre-creation waters, for if Apophis was a remnant of Nun, only those born of Nun's own depths might hold knowledge of how to bind him. She found them in the shadow of the endless lotus, their forms flickering like dreams, half-remembered. They spoke without words, showing her visions of a rope made not of fibre or reed, but of the first sound uttered in creation. That sound, they revealed, had been spoken by Ptah in the moment he called the world from thought into being. If spoken again, it could coil around the serpent and seal him beyond the horizon for 1,000,000 years. But such a sound could not be remembered by mortals or even by most gods. It had to be drawn from the breath of the Hidden One, Amun himself, and so Isis turned her steps toward Thebes, where the great temple rose like a mountain of stone and shadow. She entered its innermost sanctuary, where the air itself seemed to bend under unseen weight, and there she called to Amun. The answer came as a wind without source, curling around her with the scent of distant water. Amun, unseen and unseeable, spoke into her mind the shape of the word, a sound so old it was more a movement of the soul than of the tongue. She bowed her head, for in that instant she understood that such a word could not merely bind, it could also unmake, if spoken without the balance of Maat. When the next night came and the bark sailed again, Isis stood beside Set and Maat, her presence quiet but burning. As Apophis rose from the waters, larger than ever, she stepped forward, the unspoken sound trembling at the edge of the world. The serpent lunged, jaws wide, but before his teeth could close, she released the word into the black air. It was not heard so much as felt, a ripple through the skin of existence. Apophis writhed, his coils shattering into streams of darkness, his body forced back into the depths. For a moment, the duat grew still, and Ra's bark sailed onward without the serpent's shadow. But Isis knew, as did all aboard, that such stillness would not last forever. The word could bind, but never destroy. Creation's victory was always temporary, for the waters of Nun had no end, and from them new serpents could rise. Still the gods returned to the dawn, and the sun lifted above the horizon, pouring gold across the river and the fields. Mortals awoke to a day that felt lighter, though they could not name why. And somewhere a boy placed another reed boat upon the water, smiling as the current carried it away. The world had taken on a rhythm now, a beat that pulsed with the measured heart of Maat, yet always the whispers of Isfet lingered, patient as the deep waters beneath the earth. Ra still crossed the sky each day, though he moved slower than he once had, and each night his journey through the duat was longer, more fraught with shadows. The gods who had sprung from the first moments of creation now lived in a landscape of temples and fields, deserts and rivers, cities and tombs. Mortals were countless now, scattered along the fertile spine of the Nile, their lives a fragile balance between the abundance of the river and the menace of the desert winds. They sang praises to the gods in the morning and feared them in the night, for they had learned the truth that divine favor could bless but also destroy. In Thebes, the great Amun's priests walked in long, slow processions, their white linen robes catching the gold of the sun. The god himself, veiled in mystery, was said to watch over creation from beyond the reach of mortal eyes, his breath still stirring the air of the living. They told that Amun had been present before all else, a hidden force wrapped in the darkness of Nun, and that even when the other gods rose to prominence, his unseen hand guided fate. The Memphite priest spoke in another voice, proclaiming that Ptah had spoken the world into being by thought and word, and that his ka still resonated through every crafted thing. In Heliopolis they maintained the primacy of Atum, the self-created one, father and mother of gods whose first act of creation had set in motion all that had followed. These truths were not argued, but accepted side by side, for the Egyptians understood that creation had many layers, each god's role a facet of a greater whole. They saw the cosmos as an endless act of becoming, not a single event locked in the past, and so they honored each cycle, each telling as true. Yet, as these beliefs intertwined, so too did the fates of the gods themselves, their actions echoing across the two lands. Osiris, once a living king, now ruled the Duat with the patience of eternity. His realm was one of judgment and renewal, where the hearts of mortals were weighed against the feather of Maat. To those who had lived well, his kingdom was a place of green fields and gentle waters, where the soul could work the land without hunger or thirst. To the guilty it was a place of dissolution, where the devourer awaited the unworthy. Isis remained at his side, still working her magic in the living world, guiding kings, protecting children, and whispering to the hearts of the faithful. Her search for pieces of her husband had long ended, but her role as protector had only grown, and many a mortal called upon her name in childbirth or in sickness. Horus, their son, now sat upon the throne of the living, his human incarnations ruling the two lands in unbroken succession. Each pharaoh was the living Horus, the link between divine and mortal realms, carrying the duty of maintaining Maat. But even Horus could not keep all threats at bay. Set, his uncle, had not vanished into the desert forever. Though defeated in their ancient conflict, Set still found ways to assert his presence, particularly in the barren edges of the land and in the storms that swept across the Red Sea. Some among the people feared him, others honored him, for he was a necessary force, the protector of Ra's bark during its nightly journey, the slayer of Apophis, and the god of strength against chaos. Yet Set's temper was a thing to be wary of, and in the wrong moment his rage could turn even his allies into enemies. It was in this age of many truths and many powers that another great weaving of the cycles began. In Hermopolis, the priests of Thoth kept the mysteries of the Ogdoad alive, teaching of the 8 primeval gods, Nun and Naunet, He and Hauhet, Kuk and Kauket, Amun and Amaunet, who had stirred the waters before creation's first dawn. They told how these ancient beings had raised the first mound from the abyss, how their breath had carried the potential for all life. Thoth himself, the scribe of the gods, walked between these versions of creation like a bridge, recording the deeds of every god and mortal, ensuring that nothing was forgotten. It was whispered that Thoth could rewrite reality itself with his words, for what was written in the divine script became truth. And yet, even as these stories were retold, the forces of Isfet gathered strength in hidden corners. Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, struck with renewed cunning, hurling himself against Ra's bark in the depths of the Duat. Some nights the stars seemed to flicker as the battle raged unseen, the god Set standing at the prow with his spear, fending off the coils of darkness. When Apophis was wounded, the sun rose bright and strong. When the serpent came close to victory, the dawn broke pale and trembling. The priests performed nightly rites to aid Ra's passage, spitting upon effigies of the serpent, trampling them underfoot, burning them in fire. For they knew that the victory of light over chaos was never final. It was an eternal struggle woven into the fabric of time itself. In Memphis, the god Ptah spoke once more, not to create the world anew, but to shape the hearts of artisans and builders. Under his inspiration, temples rose with columns like papyrus reeds, ceilings painted with stars, floors cool as the river mud. Each stone was placed not merely for strength, but in harmony with the unseen laws of Ma'at. In the carving of statues, the smelting of metals, the weaving of linen, the touch of Ptah's car was felt, making each work an offering to the gods. Even Ra, Lord of the Sun, was honored in these creations, for in the orderliness of human work lay a reflection of the divine order. As centuries passed, the gods themselves seemed to shift in their roles. Amun, once hidden, merged with Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods, uniting the power of the sun with the mystery of the unseen. His temples at Karnak expanded into vast complexes where priests moved like shadows in the cool corridors, where obelisks pierced the sky, and where the great festivals saw his image carried through the city to the cheers of the people. His voice was rarely heard, but his presence was felt in the prosperity of the land, in the strength of the Nile's flood, in the peace between Upper and Lower Egypt. The world of mortals grew rich with trade, drawing in foreign lands, strange gods, and new stories. Some were woven into Egypt's tapestry, others remained at the edges, watched with curiosity but not yet embraced. Through it all, the priests and storytellers kept alive the creation cycles, speaking them aloud so that the world would remember how it had come into being. For to forget the beginning was to risk losing the path forward. But there were signs, subtle yet troubling, that the balance might not hold forever. The floods began to vary, some years too low, leaving the fields dry and cracked, others too high, drowning the villages. The winds from the desert blew more fiercely, stripping the edges of the green land. Ra's journey seemed slower still, and some claimed to have seen his bark falter in the underworld. These were omens the wise could not ignore, for they knew that Ma'at was not a fixed thing, but a state that had to be constantly renewed. If the gods weakened, if the rites were neglected, the order of the world could unravel as it had before time began. Thus began a great renewal of worship, a turning back to the oldest stories, as if to remind the gods themselves of their origins. In Heliopolis, the high priests chanted the Ennead from dawn to dusk, calling on Atum to once more breathe creation into being. In Hermopolis they sang of the Ogdoad, of the waters and the darkness that had preceded all, honoring the potential for new beginnings. In Memphis, offerings were made to Ptah not just for the works of men, but for the shaping of the very land itself. In Thebes, the veiled statues of Amun were carried to the river, bathed and adorned in gold, so that he might be renewed by the touch of the Nile. And so the cycles continued, overlapping and interlocking, each one a thread in the endless weaving of existence. The gods were not static, they were as the river, sometimes calm, sometimes flooding, sometimes retreating into silence. They were the breath in the wind, the gleam of the sun, the mystery of the stars, the pulse in the earth. Creation was not an event, but an eternal heartbeat, and as long as it beat, the world endured. Yet, somewhere beyond the horizon, in the still black waters of none, the potential for both renewal and dissolution waited, patient as ever. The people did not fear this completely, for they knew the truth that their ancestors had always whispered, that every dawn is a new creation, every flood a rebirth, every telling of the old stories a reweaving of the cosmos. So long as the gods were honored, so long as Mahat was upheld, the cycles would turn. Again and again and again, without end, the river of time that had first sprung from the waters of none continued to move forward, carrying the legacy of gods and men alike. In the high heavens, Ra still sailed across the day sky, his journey measured not only in hours, but in cycles of eternity, for each dawn was a reminder of the first light he had drawn from the darkness, and each sunset a reminder of the descent into the Duat, where challenges and enemies waited to test his strength anew. Beneath his golden path, the land of Kemet breathed under the watchful care of its divine patrons. Horus, enthroned at the heart of the living kingdom, ensured that Maat was upheld upon the earth. The Nile's annual rise and fall followed the balance of the cosmos, bringing life to the black soil and ensuring the people's survival. Every stalk of grain, every cluster of dates, every fish caught from the current was, in truth, a gift of the gods, for the gods had shaped the very order by which these gifts came to be. Yet even in this ordered realm, change was inevitable. The world was not static like the still waters of none, for movement, birth, and transformation were the rhythms of creation itself. The memories of Osiris's reign remained a guiding principle for the living, teaching that rulership was not merely a matter of strength, but of justice, and that justice was bound to the cycles of life and death. In the Duat, Osiris continued his quiet rule over the dead, presiding in judgment, weighing the hearts of souls against the feather of Maat. To those who had lived rightly, the fields of reeds lay open, mirroring the beauty of the Nile's floodplain, but untouched by drought or decay. To those who had brought Isfet into the world, there was no place in the eternal harvest. The pantheon itself had grown, as newer gods arose and older ones took on new aspects. The creative eight of the Ogdoad, once shapers of the earliest cosmos, now watched from the hidden realms, their work largely complete, but their presence still felt in the underlying forces of nature. Amun, who had hidden himself in the beginning, emerged again in later ages, his breath seen in the wind, and his hidden power recognized as the unseen root of all divinity. Ptah's words still resonated in every act of craftsmanship, in every chisel stroke and every temple stone laid, for creation was not confined to the birth of the universe, but unfolded each time humans shaped matter with intention and skill. In the hearts of the people, Thoth's wisdom endured, not only in the writing of scrolls and the recording of law, but in the understanding that thought itself was divine, that to conceive an idea was to echo the mind of the Creator. But the cycles were never free of danger. Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, still stirred in the underworld waters, never destroyed entirely, for he was the shadow without which light could not prove its strength. Each night Ra faced him, and each night the defenders of order rallied at his side. The world's continued existence was proof of their victory, but also a reminder that such victories had to be renewed without end. The people knew that their prayers, their offerings, and their remembrance of the gods were part of this eternal defense, for neglect invited chaos to creep in at the edges. To honor the gods was to help maintain the very fabric of the world. In the temples along the Nile, priests rose before dawn to awaken the statues of the gods, performing the same rites that had been taught since the first days. They washed and anointed the images, offered bread and beer, recited hymns of praise. These acts were not mere ceremony. They were the continuation of the creative acts that had brought the world into being. The recitation of a hymn was the echo of Ptah's first utterances. The lighting of a flame was the spark of Ra's first sunrise, and the placing of food before the god was an affirmation that abundance flowed from the divine order. Even the pharaoh, embodiment of Horus, understood himself as a living link between the mortal and the divine, a figure whose role was to ensure that the flow of Ma'at was unbroken. Over time, the stories of the creation became interwoven in the minds of the people, just as the gods themselves had blended their roles. In one telling, Ra emerged from Nun upon the primeval mound and brought forth Shu and Tefnut to separate sky and earth. In another, the Ogdoad stirred the waters and birthed the first hill. In yet another, Ptah spoke the world into being with his heart and tongue. None of these tales cancelled the others, for truth was not bound to a single path. The world was vast enough to hold many beginnings, each a facet of the same eternal truth, and each reaffirming that the order of existence had triumphed over the formless void. In the hidden places of the desert, beyond the reach of the Nile's life-giving floods, the memory of chaos lingered in the burning winds and shifting sands. These places were reminders that order was not guaranteed, that just as the river could rise and bless the fields, it could also fail to flood, leaving the land cracked and barren. The desert was the domain of Seth, whose nature as a god of storms and disorder had once brought tragedy to the divine family. Yet even Seth was not wholly cast out, for the cosmos had need of him in its defense. In the nightly battles against Apophis, Seth stood at the prow of Ra's bark, striking at the serpent with his spear. In this, the people saw that even chaos had a place when it served to protect creation from greater chaos still. Generations passed, and with them the memory of the earliest days became more remote, yet never forgotten. Temples rose and fell, cities flourished and faded, but the stories endured. They were painted on the walls of tombs, carved into stone lintels, written in ink on papyrus scrolls. They were whispered to children at night and recited during festivals, ensuring that the first dawn was never wholly lost to the sands of time. The gods themselves were eternal, yet their bond to the people was renewed with every telling every offering, every act of reverence. In this way, the creation was not a single moment in the distant past, but an ongoing act, sustained by divine will and human devotion alike. When the festivals of the Nile's inundation came, the people celebrated not only the rising waters, but the reenactment of the world's first birth from chaos. Boats adorned with flowers floated on the current, songs rose into the air, and offerings were cast into the river as gifts to Hapi, the spirit of the flood. In the laughter of children, in the feasting of families, in the music played on drums and flutes, there was an unspoken recognition that joy itself was part of the order the gods had willed. For to live well was to honor creation, and to celebrate life was to give thanks for the triumph of light over darkness. Thus the cycles continued, not as a closed circle that returned to its starting point, but as a great spiral, each turn bringing change, yet preserving the core truth. From the stillness of Nun to the first stirring of the Ogdoad, from the rising of the primeval mound to the shaping of the world by word and will, from the reigns of Ra and Osiris to the unending battles against Apophis, the story was never truly complete. The end was always the beginning, and the beginning was always waiting within the end. As long as the sun rose over the Nile, as long as the river flowed, and the people remembered, the creation would endure, renewed each day in the golden light of dawn. And so it was that the Egyptian creation was not a tale of a single birth, but a living testament to the resilience of order in the face of chaos, a story without a final line. The gods remained at their posts, the people at their devotions, and the world, cradled between sky and earth, continued its journey through the endless waters of time. And so the great cycles of creation turn ever onward, as they have since the first breath stirred in the silent waters of Nun. The gods, the earth, the sky, and the endless river still carry whispers of those first days when light was born from shadow and order rose from the deep. As you drift now into the quiet of night, may the voices of Atum, Ptah, Amun, and the countless spirits of Egypt keep watch over your dreams, guiding you through realms where time itself flows like the Nile. Rest well, and when the sun returns, so too may your curiosity rise again. If you wish to wander further through the myths and wonders of the ancient world, you will always find the Sleepless Librarian waiting to tell you another tale.